Clash Royale's new global tournament is starting in, well, a couple of hours, and with the most recent set of balance changes, we've had a couple new decks popping up left and right in this meta. So without further ado, let's jump right into them. Number 1, Skeleton King Graveyard Freeze. That's right, we're starting with a bit of a crazy one. This is a Skeleton King Graveyard Freeze deck that has actually done surprisingly well with these new balance changes. As with most graveyard decks, it's going to be more of a responsive counter push based deck. So starting off the match, I'm generally going to be having a pretty casual start, maybe cycling a tombstone or splitting my zappies in the back. With its control based playstyle, we're mostly going to be making positive elixir trades on defense and then transforming that positive trade into a counter push with our graveyard. So starting off on the defensive end of this deck, first off, the Zappy Stun and the Tombstone Skeletons will allow you to distract the opponent's pushes. Following that, we have the Valkyrie and the Skeleton King as mini tanks and the Inferno Dragon as your tank destroyer. As always, you can never underestimate how powerful a free spell can be on a defensive setting. Sometimes it can just get you that extra couple bits of damage in. After many of your defenses, however, you will oftentimes have surviving units on a counter push, as most of the defensive units in this deck are rather tanky. So on the offensive side, of course, you're going to want to go in with your graveyard, and 9 times out of 10, you're going to want to have a tank in front to support that graveyard. The great thing about graveyard, and especially graveyard freeze, is that because those skeletons can spawn so close to the tower, it's pretty much just guaranteed damage. So the more graveyards and the more freezes you're able to get on the opponent's tower without overcommitting, the better you're going to be in the long run. Lastly, we also have to take into account the synergy with the Skeleton King. Because the Tombstone Skeletons and the Graveyard Skeletons die super quickly, it allows the Skeleton King to charge up his ability, and in some graveyard pushes, you may have 2 waves of skeletons. The first wave from the graveyard, and the second wave from the Skeleton King. Number 2, Royal Giant Skeleton King. Despite the recent balance changes, Skeleton King is still absolutely dominant in this current meta, seen in so many different archetypes, especially in this Royal Giant deck. Now this deck is reminiscent of the old Royal Giant Skeleton decks, and so overall it's going to have a bit of a slower, more controlled playstyle. Starting off with the defensive side of this deck, first off you have the Fisherman Hunter combination, which, you know, the Fisherman pulls units in, the Hunter does the high amounts of DPS. Then of course you have the Zappies, which do a great job at stalling, and finally you have the Skeleton Army, which not only does a great job at distracting single targeting units, but also does a great job at feeding souls to the Skeleton King, whose ability is going to be very useful both on defense as well as on offense. Speaking of which, when you're playing Royal Giant decks, there are always going to be 2 different ways of making Royal Giant pushes. If you're against a cheaper deck, sometimes it's better to build up your Royal Giant pushes in the back beatdown style, and other times if you have surviving units for a counter push, well then it may be useful to play that Royal Giant at the bridge. Either way, it's important to know how to support your Royal Giant properly in order to get those connections onto the tower. For example, if the opponent has a big single hitting unit, use the Fisherman to pull that troop away. Alternatively, you can use the Skeleton King's ability to spawn some skeletons to distract those single targeting units. Aside from that, the Fireball, the Hunter, and the Zappies are all extremely effective in their own respective scenarios, but the one thing to watch out for is that spell value. A lot of the cards in this deck are weak to Fireball, so just pay attention to that before you overcommit on your Royal Giant pushes. All in all, a relatively controlled deck in single elixir time, but really be prepared to turn on the heat once you reach that double elixir. Number 3, Royal Hogs Earthquake Cycle. Now this is a deck that has been in the meta for so long, and it's continuing to be one of, if not the top deck to play right now. That being said, it does have a bit of a learning curve, so definitely practice this a little bit before trying to play in the global tournament. But starting off, this is a quick cycle deck, meaning that you're trying to maintain high amounts of pressure throughout the entire match. On the offensive end, you have a wide variety of options, from just straight up spell cycling the opponent out, which I don't really recommend at the beginning of a match, but what I'm mostly talking about is how you split the Royal Hogs at the bridge. Of course, for the most part, I recommend that you just split your Royal Hogs evenly so that 2 Royal Hogs go into each of those lanes. This can oftentimes force your opponents to pick and choose. Oftentimes they can really only effectively defend one of those sides, and if they have a building, well then you can just get a free earthquake in on the tower. This is part of what makes this deck so good, because if you have a consistent counter to the Royal Hogs, that oftentimes means you have a building. So even if you can counter the Royal Hogs, you're still gonna get like a free 200 or so damage from that earthquake. One final trick you can use in overtime or triple elixir is you can actually manipulate your cycle speed with the Archer Queen. I'm not really gonna go too deep into this, but the gist of it is if you have an Archer Queen down on the field, you only have to cycle 3 cards to get back to a second earthquake or a second set of Royal Hogs. On the defensive end is where this deck gets a little bit sketchy. First off, you have the Archer Queen, which is going to be, well, it's gonna be your main defensive unit aside from the cannon. These 2 cards are going to be your saving graces, so make sure you play with the mindset that you want to cycle back to a second one as soon as the first one dies. This is going to be especially important if your opponent is running a big spell such as the lightning to take out the Archer Queen. Aside from that, the royal delivery and the log actually do a surprisingly large amount of damage, and the skeletons and fire spirit are just great at doing overall distraction work. All in all, a quick deck that you're gonna want to constantly be applying pressure on in order to prevent your opponents from building up those big pushes. Number 4, Archer Queen Bridge Spam. This is the current version of Bridge Spam that is the most popular in Clash Royale. Overall, despite it not being the cheapest deck, it is a very aggressive deck, and the amount of double lane pressure that you can amount with this deck is absolutely insane. Starting off with this match, I'm always going to be cycling some of my cheap cards at the bridge, may that be a Bandit or a Royal Ghost or a Heal Spear. After that, I generally want to be on the aggressive side of this match. So over and over, I'm just going to be building up waves of bridge spam pushes that I will send it towards my opponent's towers. The best way to do this, in my opinion, is to apply double lane pressure. So by sending maybe a bandit in one lane, a royal ghost in another, and even splitting your elite barbarians in the center, you're going to be able to force your opponent's hand, and oftentimes they just won't be able to effectively defend both sides of the arena. Not to mention, you also have the battle ram, which is a great way to catch your opponents off guard, as well as the magic archer, who can get lots of sneaky connections onto the opponent's tower if you know how to play him correctly. The one thing to note with this deck is that there is no big spell, or rather there isn't really a spell at all, so you just really have to be careful that you take down a full tower before you really move your focus onto the next one. The defensive end of this deck, though, is relatively straightforward. You have so much high output damage from the Elite Barbarians to the Archer Queen, and you have so much splash damage from the Royal Ghost to the Magic Archer that ground defense should not be too big of an issue. If you know you're against an air deck, well, it's very important to save your Magic Archer and your Archer Queen. And of course, if all else fails, remember, this is a bridge spam deck. So if the opponent's got a giant balloon push down one lane and you just simply cannot defend, well then just spam all your units in the opposite lane and go for a tower trade. This sort of aggressive playstyle is what makes Bridge Spam so effective, so definitely another top choice. Number 5, Lava Hound Skeleton King Spam. That's right, we can't end an episode without sharing a Lava Hound deck. Now, of course, this is also the season of the Lava Hounds, so okay, anyways, with this being a Lava Hound deck, we are all about that aggression. Even at the beginning of the match, I'm already thinking about building up some Lava Hound pushes. Going in with the Lava Hound in the back, and of course, my general Lava Hound formula applies, and that is a Lava Hound in the back, and then support the Lava Hound with only one of your support units. This serves 2 purposes. First off, it avoids spell value if your opponent has a medium spell in cycle. And second, it'll save some elixir, which will allow you to reactively play some arrows or a miner if necessary. The miner is very useful as a tank when the Lava Hound pops, but you can also send it in to whatever defense the opponent has to begin damaging that defensive unit down. Lastly, you of course have the Skeleton King, which also serves a similar purpose as the Miner. It serves as an alternative tank for when that Lava Hound pops. Combining that with the Tombstone Skeleton that, feeds souls to the Skeleton King, that just allows you to build up such an oppressive offense. Moving on to the defense of this deck is where things get a little bit sketchy, but even then you still have relatively good answers. First off, with this being a Lava Hound deck with the Skeleton King, you have an extra ground defensive unit, and it's also rather tanky. The Tombstone and Skeleton King are going to be your two main ground defensive options. By using those two troops to stall the opponent's push, and then adding in your Skeleton Dragons, your Flying Machine, and your Mega Minion to damage those opponent's units down, you're going to be able to relatively effectively take down a lot of your opponent's pushes. All in all, it's a very, very aggressive deck, so the whole goal is to make sure that you are on the gas pedal of this match.